My name's Jake. I'm 35, single, and living in the house my mother left me when she passed away 2 years ago. It's a modest two-story in the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, where the air smells like pine and the neighbors still wave from their porches. The house isn't just wood and drywall. It's where I grew up, where I nursed my mother through her final days, and where I found solace after she was gone. My relationship with my father has always been complicated. After Mom died, he remarried a woman named Linda within 6 months. Linda came with a daughter, Emily, who was 22 at the time and already pregnant. Dad and I drifted further apart. Our conversations reduced to awkward holiday dinners and obligatory birthday calls. Things started to unravel last spring. I came home from work one evening to find my key no longer fit the front door. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I tried the back door. Same result. Confused and increasingly anxious, I called my father. He answered on the third ring, sounding irritated. He informed me, rather bluntly, that he and Linda had decided it was best for Emily to move into the house. She needed space for the baby, and since I was just one person, they figured I could find somewhere else to live. I was stunned. This was my home, legally and emotionally. I reminded him that Mom had left the house to me in her will. He dismissed it, claiming that since he was her husband, he had a say in the matter. I spent that night in a motel, my mind racing. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. She confirmed that the house was indeed mine. The will was clear. Changing the locks without my consent was illegal. Armed with this information, I planned my next move. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Thompson, told me that if my father and Linda tried to evict me or change the locks again, I had every right to involve the police. But even with that assurance, I couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. It wasn't just about them wanting me out. It was about how little they thought of me, how easy it was for them to shove me aside the moment I became inconvenient. I decided not to confront them immediately. Instead, I returned home with a locksmith in tow. Watching the guy pop the lock open and replace it with a new set of keys felt oddly satisfying. When I walked back inside, it was like reclaiming more than just property. It was reclaiming my place, my worth, my memory of Mom. But just as I was starting to breathe easier, a knock came at the door. I opened it, and there stood Linda, her face red and twisted with indignation. She had Emily with her, baby bump visible under a floral dress, looking smug. Linda started hurling accusations. How dare I change the locks? How dare I make a pregnant woman feel unsafe? I calmly told her she was trespassing and that the house was legally mine. That's when Emily, in her usual passive-aggressive tone, dropped the twist that almost made me laugh. Dad said he's calling the cops if you don't let us in. He says you're stealing the house. Stealing. The house that had my mother's name on the deed, that I'd grown up in, that I'd kept from falling apart after she died. That's when I realized they weren't just hoping I'd leave. They were trying to gaslight me into thinking I had no right to stay. They were trying to rewrite the story altogether. I told them both to leave and shut the door in their faces, but my hands were trembling. After that confrontation, I expected things to cool down. Maybe a few cold calls or texts, but nothing more. I was wrong. The next morning, I found a notice pinned to the front door, a cease and desist letter from a lawyer representing my father and Linda. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. They were accusing me of trespassing on my own property. I took the letter to Ms. Thompson, who nearly rolled her eyes out of her head reading it. She assured me it was a weak attempt at intimidation. But just to be safe, she suggested filing a formal complaint with the county and documenting everything. I started keeping a detailed journal, dates, times, conversations, and even took pictures of every notice, every aggressive interaction. Then came the second twist. A neighbor, Mrs. Miller, who'd known my mom for decades, stopped me as I was leaving for work. She leaned in conspiratorially, said she'd seen Linda and my father meeting with a real estate agent at the edge of the driveway a few nights ago. They were apparently trying to sell the house behind my back, despite the will. That revelation hit me like a punch to the chest. I wasn't just being bullied out of my home. They were trying to erase me altogether, cash in, and leave me with nothing. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about standing my ground anymore. This was war. I hired a second attorney, one specializing in estate fraud and property law. Ms. Thompson worked with him to prepare a formal injunction preventing the sale of the house and freezing any transaction. Meanwhile, I changed the locks again, installed security cameras, and made sure the neighbors knew what was going on. If they were going to try and steal the roof over my head, I was going to fight them every inch of the way. But just when I thought the storm was raging at its worst, Emily found a new card to play. The following week, I got a call from my lawyer, her voice tight with frustration. Emily had filed a temporary restraining order against me. The claim? That I was harassing her, threatening her and the baby, and making it impossible for her to feel safe. I almost dropped the phone. This was absurd. I'd barely said a word to her aside from telling her to leave the property. But Emily's story painted me as some deranged aggressor, unhinged and dangerous. That's when I understood her play. If the restraining order stuck, I'd be legally barred from the house, giving them free rein to move in or sell it. They were willing to lie under oath to strip me of everything my mother left me. I felt my gut tighten with a mix of rage and disbelief. But Ms. Thompson was ready. We gathered evidence, security footage from my newly installed cameras showing Emily and Linda pounding on the door, yelling at me, not the other way around. I had text messages from Emily herself, some passive-aggressively demanding access, others casually hinting at her plans. Ms. Thompson filed a counterclaim with this evidence, arguing that Emily's story was fabricated and retaliatory. Meanwhile, Emily doubled down. She plastered her version of events all over social media, painting me as the unstable black sheep of the family. Friends and distant relatives reached out, some expressing concern, others clearly siding with her. I could almost hear her gloating, thinking she'd won this round. But she underestimated one thing. My mother had been a meticulous woman. In her will, she'd included not just the deed to the house, but a detailed letter, spelling out her reasons for leaving it to me. I hadn't shown anyone that letter. Until now. I pulled it from the file I kept tucked away, reread her words, and felt something settle inside me. My mother had trusted me with this home, this legacy, because she believed I would honor it. I wasn't just fighting for walls and a roof. I was fighting for her memory. The next hearing was going to be brutal, but I wasn't backing down. The day of the hearing arrived, and I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. I sat in the courtroom, heart pounding, trying to appear calm, while my lawyer flipped through her notes with practiced ease. Across the room, Emily sat smugly, her pregnant belly on full display, as if it were a shield. Linda sat beside her, whispering something with a look of exaggerated concern. My father? Nowhere in sight. Typical. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, called the hearing to order. Emily's lawyer made their case first, painting me as an unhinged aggressor who'd locked a poor pregnant woman out of her rightful home. They paraded photos of Emily looking distraught, screenshots of social media posts where she described feeling unsafe, and even managed to twist a few text exchanges into sounding threatening. But Ms. Thompson was ready. When our turn came, she presented the security footage, clearly showing Emily and Linda as the instigators. She highlighted the texts where Emily herself demanded entry, and calmly pointed out the inconsistencies in their story. Finally, she handed over my mother's letter, the one where she explicitly explained her decision to leave me the house. The judge read it silently, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, I felt the weight of her gaze settle on me. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "you have presented clear evidence that this property was left to you and that you have been unfairly targeted. This restraining order is denied. Furthermore, I am instructing Ms. Emily and her legal counsel to cease all attempts to claim this property unless they can provide valid documentation, which they clearly do not have." Emily's mouth opened in shock, and Linda's face flushed deep red. My pulse roared in my ears, but a weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But then, just as the hearing was wrapping up, Emily's lawyer stood and requested a continuance. They claimed there were new documents that might change the case. I felt my gut twist. They weren't done. They were just regrouping. A week later, I found myself sitting across from Ms. Thompson in her office, staring at the so-called new documents Emily's side had produced. They were laughably amateurish, copies of an alleged revised will supposedly signed by my mother just months before her death, conveniently leaving everything to my father. The signatures didn't match, the dates were inconsistent, and there was no notarization. But for them, it wasn't about authenticity, it was about dragging me through the mud and exhausting me until I gave up. Ms. Thompson reassured me, her tone calm but steely. "We had solid evidence," she said, "and the court would see through the obvious forgery." But she also warned me that the next hearing would be brutal. They'd bring out every dirty trick, every half-truth, every manipulative story they could muster. She asked if I was ready for that. I thought I was. But then came the next twist. That evening, as I was going through my mother's old filing cabinet, one I hadn't touched since she passed, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was a handwritten note from her, dated 2 weeks before she died. In it, she detailed how she'd felt pressured by my father and Linda to change the will, but she refused. She even mentioned a notary friend who could confirm the story if it ever came to a legal battle. The letter was clear. She wanted me to have the house, and she wanted me to stand up for myself. My hands trembled as I read it. This wasn't just legal ammunition. This was my mother speaking from beyond the grave, telling me I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the villain they were trying to paint me as. I made a copy of the letter and called Ms. Thompson immediately. She was silent for a moment before saying, "This changes everything." The next hearing wasn't just going to be a fight. It was going to be my fight. The day of the hearing dawned with a gray, stubborn drizzle that seemed determined to soak Asheville to the bone. I woke early, not that I'd slept much. My mind had been racing all night, rehearsing arguments, counterarguments, every possible twist they might throw at me. But as I stood in front of the mirror, tying my tie with trembling hands, I thought of my mother's letter, the one I'd found tucked away like a lifeline. Her words steadied me more than any lawyer or legal brief could. Miss Thompson met me at the courthouse. She wore her usual crisp suit, but her nod this morning carried more weight. "You ready for this, Jake?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded. I wasn't just ready. I was determined. Inside the courtroom, Linda and Emily sat on the opposite side with their lawyer, looking smug and polished. They didn't even glance my way, as if I were a minor inconvenience about to be brushed aside. But what really churned my gut was seeing my father there too, sitting with them like he belonged, his eyes fixed ahead as if the son he'd raised was just a stranger now. That cut deeper than I expected. Emily's lawyer started with the same story they tried before, only this time bolstered by their revised will, claiming my mother had changed her mind in her final days. They painted me as the greedy son who refused to respect her supposed wishes, while Emily, poor innocent Emily, just wanted a safe place for her baby. It was manipulative, dramatic, and designed to play on sympathy. When they finished, Miss Thompson rose with quiet authority. She methodically presented the evidence. The original will, the surveillance footage showing Linda and Emily banging on the door, the text messages where Emily demanded I vacate. Then she held up my mother's letter. The courtroom seemed to still as she read it aloud, my mother's voice echoing through the space as though she were right there with us. Her words were clear, heartfelt, and devastatingly precise. She described how she'd felt pressured but stood her ground, how she wanted the house to stay with me because she trusted me to honor its history and care for it. She even mentioned her notary friend, a woman named Carol Barnes, who could confirm my mother's intentions. At that moment, it wasn't just about wills and legalities. It was about a mother's last wishes being twisted and erased. I felt the weight of her words settle into the room like a heavy quilt, smothering the self-righteousness radiating from Linda and Emily's side. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp features, leaned forward. "Is Ms. Barnes present today?" she asked. A woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a confident demeanor, stood up from the back of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor." Carol Barnes, notary public and longtime friend of the deceased. I witnessed her signature on the original will and can attest that she never signed any revised version. You could feel the air leave the room. Linda's lawyer stammered, Emily's face flushed red, and my father sank lower in his seat, avoiding eye contact with me. I held my breath as the judge reviewed the evidence one last time. Finally, she looked up, her voice calm but firm. "It is clear that the revised will is fraudulent and carries no legal weight. The property belongs solely to Mr. Wilson, as per the original, legally binding will. I am issuing a permanent injunction against any further claims from the opposing parties. This case is closed." It was over. Just like that, months of anxiety, betrayal, and constant tension snapped like a taut wire. I felt a rush of relief, but it was mixed with something heavier: exhaustion, grief for the relationship I'd lost with my father, and a hollow ache where family used to be. As I gathered my things, Linda shot me a venomous glare, but Emily just looked shell-shocked. My father hesitated as though he might say something, but he didn't. He just turned and followed them out, leaving me standing there, the victor in a battle I never wanted to fight. Ms. Thompson patted my shoulder. "You did it, Jake," she said softly. "I know," I replied, "but it doesn't feel like winning." I left the courthouse into the drizzle that hadn't let up. The cold air cut through my coat, but for the first time in months, I felt light. I'd protected my mother's legacy, reclaimed my home, and proven that I wasn't the pushover they'd thought I was. But as I walked back to my car, I also realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. The fight might be over, but the damage it had done to me and the people I thought I could trust would linger far longer than any legal battle. Walking out of that courtroom felt surreal. The drizzle had finally tapered off, leaving behind a wet sheen on the sidewalks of downtown Asheville. I could hear the distant echo of passing cars and the murmur of pedestrians. But for me, it was as if everything had gone quiet. My lawyer squeezed my shoulder as we parted ways. Her words, "Call me if they try anything else," echoing faintly as she disappeared into the crowd. I stood there for a long while, staring at the courthouse steps, before I finally forced myself to move. The fight was over, at least on paper. I'd won. I kept the house, protected my mother's legacy, and exposed the lies and manipulation for what they were. But it didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt hollow, like I was dragging myself across a finish line I never asked to be part of. The silence at home was almost suffocating. The house, which had once felt like a safe haven, now echoed with memories of every bitter word, every slammed door, every moment of betrayal that had unfolded since my mother's death. I couldn't walk into the living room without seeing Linda's face twisted with fury or Emily's smug smirk at the door. Even the kitchen felt tainted by the scent of their unwelcome presence. A few days later, I got a call from a mutual friend, more of an acquaintance, really. He said he'd heard through the grapevine that Emily and Linda were trying to spin the story in their favor, telling anyone who'd listened that I'd cheated them, that I'd used underhanded tactics to steal what was rightfully Emily's. They were playing the victim card so hard, it was almost impressive. I should have been furious. But instead, I felt a kind of bone-deep exhaustion. I was tired of fighting, tired of proving myself, tired of caring what people thought. So I let them talk. Let them tell their version of the story to anyone who'd listen. I had the truth, the house, and my mother's letter to remind me of what mattered. And no amount of gossip or slander could change that. But then came the final twist. One evening, just as I was settling into a rare moment of calm, there was a knock at the door. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it to find my father standing there, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes dull, his hands twisting nervously at his sides. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "Jake, can we talk?" The temptation to slam the door in his face was overwhelming, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Linda and Emily had once tried to corner me, and for a long while he just sat there, staring at the grain of the wood. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said quietly. I thought you'd roll over like always." His words hit me harder than I expected. That was it. That was the truth. He'd counted on me to be the obedient son, the one who always put family above himself, no matter how they treated me. And for a long time, he'd been right. But not anymore. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I was wrong. About you. About everything." I didn't answer right away. The apology was too little, too late. But it was something. After a long silence, I said, "I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm willing to listen." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. And for the first time in a long time, we sat together, not as father and son trying to win or lose, but as two broken people trying to figure out where it all went wrong. In the days that followed, I found myself haunted by my father's visit. His apology, though overdue and fragile, cracked open something in me I wasn't ready to face. The realization that despite everything, I still wanted a relationship with him. But not on the terms he and Linda had set. Not as the son who rolled over when told, but as an equal, a man who'd fought and earned his place. Whether he could accept that or not was out of my hands. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, old-fashioned, not from any lawyer or court. It was from my father. He wrote that Linda had left him. Apparently, after the court loss and the public fallout, she decided she didn't want to deal with the drama. Emily had moved in with her boyfriend's family, taking her child and her sense of entitlement with her. My father was alone in the same house he'd tried to force me out of. He wrote that he missed me, that he'd been blind, manipulated by Linda, desperate to hold on a family, even if it meant betraying his own son. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped maybe one day we could sit down and share a cup of coffee again, like we used to when I was a kid. Reading that letter was like ripping off a scab. It hurt, it bled, but it also felt cleansing. For the first time in months, I realized that this mess wasn't entirely my burden to carry. That guilt and grief, anger and betrayal, they weren't mine alone to hold. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where my mother's letter rested. A few days later, I saw him. It wasn't planned. I was at the grocery store, minding my business, when I caught sight of him down the aisle, hesitating near the cereal boxes. He looked smaller, somehow, diminished, like the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. I almost turned away. Almost. But then I thought of my mother, her quiet strength, her belief that family was worth fighting for, even when it hurt. So I approached him. He saw me and froze, his hands tightening around a box of oatmeal. For a moment, we just stood there, two men tangled in a web of old wounds and unspoken words. Finally, I said, "Hey, Dad." His eyes brimmed with something, regret, maybe, or gratitude. "Jake," he said softly. We didn't talk long. Just a few words about the weather, how things were going. I didn't bring up Linda or Emily, and he didn't mention the court. But as we stood there in that mundane aisle, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't a reconciliation, not really, but it was a start, a crack in the wall we'd built between us. When I got home, I stood on the porch of the house my mother had left me, watching the sun dip below the pines. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I felt something lighter, something almost like hope. But just as I was about to head inside, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It read, "This isn't over, Jake. You're going to regret what you did." My stomach turned cold. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the old dread creeping back in. Linda. It had to be. She wasn't done yet. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that though the legal fight was over, the fallout wasn't finished. The battle for the house was won, but the war for peace, real peace, was just beginning. That text haunted me for days. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of anxiety, expecting more threats, more venom. But the messages didn't come. It was as though Linda had flung that last desperate warning into the void, knowing it was her final shot before disappearing into whatever bitter world she'd built for herself. Still, her words stuck with me, echoing in the quiet hours of the night when the house seemed too big, too empty. I tried to go back to normal. I cleaned the kitchen, repainted the guest room, trying to reclaim spaces that had felt poisoned. I even replaced the locks again, this time with reinforced deadbolts, not because I thought Linda would really come back, but because I needed to feel in control, needed to feel safe. But no amount of fresh paint or new hardware could fully erase the heaviness that clung to the walls. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Miller, approaching. She hesitated at the end of the walkway, looking uncertain. I waved her over, and she shuffled closer, her lips pursed with something unspoken. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice low, "I'm sorry for everything you've been through." I didn't realize how bad it was until I heard it straight from Linda's mouth. "She's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're dangerous, unstable. But most of us here know better. We know you." Her words, simple as they were, cracked something open in me. For months, I've been carrying the weight of being painted as the villain in a story I didn't write. Hearing someone, a neighbor, a witness, acknowledge that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the bad guy, was more healing than I expected. I thanked her genuinely, and she nodded, leaving me with a plate of homemade cookies and a promise that if that woman tries anything else, you just holler. It was a small gesture, but it made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. That night, I finally allowed myself to open the boxes I'd packed away when my mother died. Old photos, letters, trinkets from my childhood. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by pieces of the past, letting the memories wash over me. There was laughter in those boxes, and love, and a reminder of the kind of person my mother was, the kind of person who fought quietly but fiercely for the people she loved. And it hit me then, as clear as the sunrise creeping over the horizon the next morning. I wasn't just fighting for bricks and beams. I wasn't just defending a piece of property. I was fighting for the right to remember my mother the way she deserved to be remembered. Not as a woman whose last wishes were ignored, but as someone who mattered. Someone who believed in me, even when everyone else doubted. The next day, I called Ms. Thompson. I asked her to start the process of securing the deed and all related documents in my name, permanently and irrevocably. I wanted there to be no more cracks for Linda or Emily or anyone to exploit. I was done reacting. It was time to move forward on my terms. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept through the night undisturbed.